Well, hello and welcome to Walking the Talk, Creekside's sermon podcast. I'm Jeff Bruce, a pastor here. I'm joined by my father, John Bruce. Dad, how are you doing?
I'm good. I'm fighting the pollen battles, but other than that, I'm in good shape.
The pollen battles.
Yes.
Are you making inroads?
They're making inroads, I think.
Into you?
Into me, yes.
Yeah.
But,
it's really a defensive war more
is.
than anything.
It
You're
is.
not the aggressor in this war. The
No.
pollen is.
No.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's a just war.
It is. It's a just war.
That's good. Well, as you might have noticed, listeners, the title of this podcast has changed. And this is a big week, Dad, because you hinted at it last week. In fact, you just changed the name arbitrarily in our last podcast. And there's a reason for that, why we're changing it. You might remember this was called Habit Helps for the first few years, and we are changing it. And we thought we'd give you a reason why. We ran out of habits. Dad, any other thoughts why we're changing it?
Yeah. We mastered life.
We mastered life.
Yes.
No, but as you might imagine, listeners, it is difficult to come up with new topics every week, new habits, and we want to make sure that we're giving you fresh, helpful content. And one thing we're always talking about here at Creekside is the Bible, and specifically the books we're preaching through. And so we thought it'd be helpful to do a podcast that's really focused on implementing the truth that we talk about on Sundays. So working through those passages in a little more granular detail, maybe adding some things that we weren't able to get to in our sermons, but also just talking about practically how do you live out what the scriptures are teaching here. All scripture is profitable for training, reproof, correction, teaching. I got those in reverse order, but you get the idea. All scripture is profitable for building habits, and so the more deeply we look at any given passage, the more we can glean practically about how to live that out. So I want to help you do that, listeners, and I think the way this series or this podcast will work most effectively is that you are listening to these talks and then listening to the podcast afterwards to really have a foundation to build on. So, Dad, any other thoughts before we jump in?
No, I think it's fun. It's fun to get to stuff that might not have made it into the sermon, or that we can go deeper in terms of actually implementing. And so I think it's necessary.
Great. Well, over the last few weeks, we've been in Luke 7. We looked at verses 1 through 10, the healing of the centurion's servant, and then we looked at Jesus raising a widow's son in verses 11 through 17. So we'll work through these passages and talk a little bit more about them, starting with the healing of the centurion's servant. Scripture says this: after he had finished all his sayings in the hearing of the people, he entered Capernaum. Now a centurion had a servant who was sick and at the point of death, who was highly valued by him. When the centurion heard about Jesus, he sent to him elders of the Jews, asking him to come and heal his servant. And when they came to Jesus, they pleaded with him earnestly, saying, "He is worthy to have you do this for him, for he loves our nation, and he is the one who built us our synagogue." And Jesus went with them. When he was not far from the house, the centurion sent friends, saying to him, "Lord, do not trouble yourself, for I am not worthy to have you come under my roof. Therefore, I did not presume to come to you. But say the word and let my servant be healed. For I too am a man set under authority with soldiers under me, and I say to one, 'Go,' and he goes, and to another, 'Come,' and he comes, and to my servant, 'Do this,' and he does it." When Jesus heard these things, he marveled at him, and turning to the crowd that followed him, said, "I tell you, not even in Israel have I found such faith." And when those who had been sent returned to the house, they found the servant well. Dad, thoughts on this passage?
I think that Jesus sets the tone with his comment about the centurion's faith. That's probably what we need to focus on. Is this is a great example of faith, and it's an amazing thing that not even in Israel has Jesus found anyone with such great faith, and so that's kind of highlighting. So what was great about this centurion's faith? What do we learn about faith from this? And I think Jesus probably talked more about faith than anything else. And so anytime we get some insight into faith, it's very valuable.
Yeah, without faith, it's impossible to please God. So it's very important that we have a correct definition of what this is.
Right.
And the centurion is illustrating
Yes.
the nature of faith.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, so I was thinking about that. I mean, it really stands out that Jesus marvels at something. He
Yes.
marvels at unbelief, but to marvel at belief is kind of an amazing
Right.
something to marvel at in the
Right.
text. Wow, that Jesus is moved by this man's faith.
Yes.
And,
Yes.
and then that not even in Israel, essentially the entire nation of God's people doesn't exhibit such faith.
Yeah.
Which,
Yeah.
of course, is an indictment on Israel.
Yeah.
And part of Luke's point is that Jesus is saving those on the margins, not
Yeah.
those you think he would come to expect. But yeah, I'm curious, what do you think? What is it about his faith that really gets to the root of what faith is?
He obviously doesn't have faith in himself, because in two times he shows that he doesn't feel like he's worthy to come to Jesus. And so the faith is not in himself. I think the whole issue of authority, to me, is the key. And he doesn't say, I am a man who has authority, just like you. But he says, I am a man under authority, just like you.
Right.
And I have authority because I stay under the authority of Caesar. And so when I give an order, it is as if Caesar were giving an order. And that's why I can say to this soldier, come, and this soldier, go, and they will obey me, not because of who I am, but because of the authority I'm under. I see you are in the same situation, Jesus, that you are under the authority of God. And therefore, whatever you say will happen.
Right.
Because you are speaking with God's voice.
Yeah. I think if you go back to Luke 3, where Jesus is baptized with the Spirit, in a sense, he's authorized by God
Yes.
at that point to act on God's behalf
Yeah.
and to reveal God's will. And then in the ensuing chapters, you see people respond differently to Jesus' authority. And everyone, in a sense, recognizes he has authority, but not everyone understands that authority correctly.
Right. Right.
Some people think it's an authority to do whatever they want him to do for them. Obviously,
Yeah.
the demons think he has authority, and they don't like his authority.
Yeah.
They
Yeah.
bristle under his authority. But everyone, in a sense, has a sense that Jesus is the authority. But I think you're right that this man sees the deeper issue here, that Jesus is acting on God's agenda.
Yeah. Exactly. And that's why he says, you don't have to come to my house,
Right.
because God's here. And so if you say it'll happen, it'll happen.
Right.
You know, and he obviously, that was very, very different than everybody else had to have Jesus come. There's only one other example I can think of Jesus healing from a distance, and that's in the early parts of John. And Jesus has to initiate that.
Right.
And but this man comes up with that on his own.
And I think the other thing that stands out there is the authority of Jesus' word in particular.
Yeah.
That you saying something is as good as you doing something.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just like with me, if I issue an order, it's like it's from Caesar himself. It's going to
Right.
get done.
Right.
And so I don't need you to go. And I think that's the other thing about saving faith that I see here is it's taking God at his word.
Yes.
I don't need to see you do more in my life, God. I don't need to see more evidences to be more convinced of the truth of this statement. If you say do it, I will do it.
Yeah.
Because you're speaking as you're doing. And I
Yeah.
think that's really the nature of faith throughout the Bible is that it's taking God at his word.
Right. Kyle did a good job of breaking down the centurion's faith, I thought, and it was very helpful because I think a lot of Christians struggle with the issue of faith. And so he said, first of all, that faith sees its need. And obviously the centurion, his servant is about to die. He's run out of options. And so when he hears about Jesus, he immediately sends this delegation to hopefully bring Jesus to them. So it's just, you cannot be a person of faith without seeing there's much of my life is impossible to manage apart from God. I need strength and power, protection, provision that I do not have access to myself, that I need. So faith begins with seeing your own need, seeing yourself. And so if you're a self-sufficient person, you cannot be a person of faith. That's all there is. You've got to decide, who am I going to depend on? Am I going to depend on me? Or am I going to depend on God? And then second of all, that faith believes that God can. And I thought that was a great point. And I think Kyle took that from the centurion's word. Just say the word, and my servant will be healed.
Right.
He's not saying you must do this. He's not ordering Jesus or anything, but he believes that Jesus can. And that's so much of faith gets confused, I think. But it really gets down, do I believe that God can deal with this? That he's able to? And then the last thing, faith asks that God will. And it makes a distinction between believing that God can and believing that he will.
Our must,
yeah.
Right.
That God is not under our authority in any way, but he does listen to our requests.
Yeah.
And I think there's that covers a multitude of sins in terms of how people look at faith.
Yeah. Yeah, do you think that in our culture, people generally veer toward believing God must or not believing God can? I guess because there's a pendulum there, right? Or there's a balance where I think for some people, they're just not confident that God is at work in the world. And so they won't take risks. They won't venture. They don't, as William Carey said, expect great things from God, attempt great things for God. Until you expect God to do big things, you're not going to attempt big things.
Exactly.
And so that's one end. And then I think on the other end is this sense of faith is a principle that God has to abide by in some way, and so that I can compel him to act. Where do you think most people land on that spectrum?
Well, I think most people would err in the former.
Yeah.
That most people believe that God can't, or that
or God won't,
or he won't, whatever, that God is not really a viable option for me here. I think there are a smaller group of people from certain cults who believe that God must do this, and so I can control God. It's the genie in the bottle idea, that God becomes my servant because I believe that he can, and I believe that he will, and so he must do it. So I think that those are two extremes, and I think they're extremes of the same sin, and that is believing that my thoughts define God, rather than believing in the God of the Bible.
Right. Yeah, they're both ways of limiting God, in a sense, and not seeing who he is. Yeah, I would say that I think one of the reasons we don't venture is we're afraid of being disappointed. We pray for something and the prayer doesn't get answered, or doesn't get answered the way we want. We take a risk and we fall flat on our face. And I think, the people I see who see God do the most are the people who risk the most.
Yes. Now we're studying Daniel in our Bible study, and I love the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego when they stand before the king, and he's mad because they won't worship his idol, the idol of him, and they say God is able to deliver us from the fiery furnace. But even if he doesn't, we're still not going to we're not going to worship your idol, king. And I think that's the right attitude. God can do this, and if it pleases him, he will. But we're going to do the right thing regardless.
Yeah, you think of Jonathan in 1 Samuel 14, come, let us go over to the garrison of these uncircumcised. It may be that the Lord will work for us. For nothing can hinder the Lord from saving by many or by few.
Yeah.
And that kind of confidence is at the root of biblical faith.
Yes.
And I think so often it's just nothing ventured, nothing gained. You have not because you've asked not. And you just got to get more comfortable failing at things.
Exactly.
To see God work. I heard J.P. Moreland talk about praying for healing in people's lives. And do you really want to see God do miraculous healing? And he talked to a guy who'd seen tons of miraculous healing.
Yeah.
And he said, well, how often do you see it? And he said, pray with 200 people for healing. You'll see 5 get healed.
Yeah. That's good.
He said, I'm very confident you will.
Yeah.
See 5 get miraculously healed.
Yeah.
And probably more. And I thought, wow, but that's a great...
That sounds about right.
That's a great model, I thought, of persistence in prayer.
Yeah.
And you can't build faith unless you venture, unless you ask, unless you risk, because it's a muscle that has to be built. And as you see God work, the temperature of your faith begins to rise, the expectation begins to rise that he's going to do things.
Yeah, yeah. Pray about everything.
Yeah.
That's what the Bible says. And I'm more and more beginning to keep track of my prayers so I can see what prayers were answered, just to build my own faith.
Yeah.
And it's amazing. And just
Yeah.
Little things, big things.
Yeah, and recording answered prayers is a huge part of building faith.
Yeah.
Because we so easily forget what God has done.
Oh.
We need to recall it. And
Yeah.
Kyle made that point too. You got to. This is how you increase the temperature of your faith: is
Yeah.
seeing, no, God did that, God did that, God did that. Don't forget.
Yeah.
And
that's
that's really
good.
good. I think one other practical thing I would say, just as you're thinking through your day and praying through it, ask God, God, what risk are you calling me to take today? What are you inviting me into?
Yeah.
And to have a spirit of anticipation and adventure about what God might do.
Yeah. Yeah. That's good. That's good. No, I thought it was a great talk and a great passage, and has a lot to say about an essential area of faith, because it's easy to be, it's easy to kind of go through the religious motions and never live by faith.
Yeah. That's good. Any other thoughts on the centurion?
I think that's it.
Well, let's go on then. Verses 11 through 17. Luke says this: Soon afterward, he went to a town called Nain, and his disciples and a great crowd went with him. As he drew near to the gate of the town, behold, a man who had died was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow. And a considerable crowd from the town was with her. And when the Lord saw her, he had compassion on her and said to her, Do not weep. Then he came up and touched the bier, and the bearers stood still. And he said, Young man, I say to you, arise. And the dead man sat up and began to speak. And Jesus gave him to his mother. Fear seized them all, and they glorified God, saying, A great prophet has arisen among us, and God has visited his people. And this report about him spread through the whole of Judea and all the surrounding country. You have Jesus healing a person again, and healing them for the sake of another.
Right.
Just like with the story of the centurion and his servant. And again, you have the power of Jesus' word. First time doing a remote healing, and this time raising someone from the dead.
Yeah.
So those are the similarities, but I also think there's some differences here that are significant. What do you think, Dad?
Well, I like the way that you really focused on Jesus' compassion, the reason he did this, and what does that teach us about compassion, and not only compassion, but what his design for us is as new creations who are to become like him. I thought that was a really powerful point that you made there. I just think too, it's just Jesus is so bold. I mean, he is compassionate, but he's also bold. I mean, I can't imagine walking up and stopping a funeral procession with all these people awake and telling them, "Stop weeping. This is under control."
It's a present imperative in Greek.
Yeah.
So the implication is the weeping is in process.
Yeah.
And Jesus is saying, "Stop."
Yeah.
Which only Jesus says stuff like this.
When you think about all the times out on the road, you have to stop for some long funeral line of cars, going to a funeral, because funerals are really priority,
Right.
And then he does that right. This poor widow and loses her only son, and but he does that out of compassion.
Right.
So why did you choose to really focus on compassion as the theme of this passage?
Yeah, obviously you could preach it in different ways, and you could talk about Jesus' authority over death. I think that comes up again in Luke 8, with the raising of Jairus and his daughter.
Right.
And so, strategically when you're preaching through things, you don't want to cover the same thing too many times.
Yeah.
And so I thought that's a great passage on Jesus' authority over death as well.
Yeah.
I think what struck me about it is just how there's a beautiful simplicity to the passage where Jesus just responds. He's moved to do something. And it really gives you a window into Jesus' heart.
Yeah.
That there's no greater lesson here. There's no greater, obviously, the lesson to Jesus' authority over death, but it's just a great view into the heart of Christ.
Yeah.
And I think what stood out to me, too, is that compassion really is an affection. I mean, it's in the word. It's implicit there. It's a passion, compassion to suffer with.
Yeah.
And I think often I think about growing in the Christian life, obviously in terms of habits, but that can become reduced to just growing in skills, actions.
Yeah.
Disciplines.
Yeah.
And that's key. But as Jonathan Edwards said, a huge part of the Christian life are affections.
Yeah.
And growing affections that are like Christ's. The fruit of the Spirit are affections. And so it got me thinking, how do you grow in an affection? How do you grow in a feeling? And that kind of, I thought, that'd be a good thing to camp out on because, usually you camp out on something that speaks to you personally. And I thought, I'm pretty good at showing mercy in the moment. But feeling compassion for people is not my strong suit. And yet it was the heart of Christ. And so I thought, I can't just use it as an excuse. To say, well, I'm not compassionate or that's not my personality. That's not an excuse for Christians because we have the Spirit of Christ in us.
And I think that's a great insight because it's very common for us to say, well, this is my background or this is my family of origin or this is whatever, and as an excuse to dismiss an absence of a particular virtue. Well, I'm quick-tempered because, or I'm just depressive because, or rather than saying, no, this is something that Christ wants to redeem. He wants to make you like himself. That's the point. You're not chained to the past, but you're going to have to cooperate with the process. And I think just saying that he wants to make us all compassionate people. That's why all the commands about putting on a heart of compassion are there.
Yeah, our 1 John 3:17 really stood out to me too, that you see your brother in need and close your heart to them, close your bowels, right? Close your intestines. And it's a very visceral image, right? It's the same word used here. How can the love of God be in that person? Well, the subtext is, or the converse of that is, if the love of God is in you, then you will feel things. You will be moved in certain ways in your heart. And that's challenging, but it's also encouraging because it means that if the Spirit of God is in me, I don't have to muster this up or something. He already wants to develop this heart in me. I just have to cooperate with what he's doing.
Yeah. Well, maybe it'd be good to kind of fast forward to the practical implications you had at the end there about how do you actually develop a heart of compassion?
Yeah, I talked about confessing it, attending to people. And if you heard the sermon, you heard that, obviously looking at Jesus, who the great high priest has a heart full of compassion for his people. That is his heart. I think for me with compassion, and my wife has helped me more than anybody in this, because this is an area where she can do laps around me, is compassion, is not creating an image of a person in my mind, but dealing with them as they are. Doesn't mean they're pretty. But it means you have to learn to deal with people as they are, where they are, is the starting point of compassion. And the reason I say that is I think it's a great temptation to villainize people in our head when they're not in front of us. And think, here's what they're thinking. Here's what they're doing. Here's why they're so stubborn. Here's why they're da-da-da-da-da. And the more you do that, the more callous you become toward people.
Yeah, naturally.
Yeah. You don't see yourself in that person anymore. And you become justified in your thinking. And so I think it's very important, especially when you're with people, to just observe people. Observe what they're feeling. Observe where they're coming from. And I'm not very observant. My wife will say, "Oh, did you see how crestfallen or how his countenance changed when that person said that?" And I'll think, I was just thinking of the next thing I was supposed to say. I wasn't thinking about I didn't perceive anything. I live in my head a lot. And so I think the first step to compassion is attention. Paying attention to people.
I think the first step to compassion is confession.
Well, yeah, and I said that.
Because,
the next
and
step.
You did that. And I think that's a great point because that got me to thinking, I've known I was supposed to confess my sins forever, ever since I became a Christian. But I just began realizing that apart from confession, there'll be no cleansing. There'll be no freeing of sin. And so if there's any sin I'm struggling with, or I recognize I need to be confessing that to God, to be cleansed by him, because otherwise it becomes a law. It becomes something separated from God himself in terms of why I'm doing this. And that rather than coming to him and confessing, Lord, I'm sinning in this. I need you to cleanse me of that. I'm seeing how powerful that is. And the other thing that struck me too along that was the last point. But we cannot separate compassion or any quality of Jesus from Jesus. And so the goal is not to become a more compassionate person. The goal is to become a more Christ-like person. And so it's
to have his compassion.
Yes, only by looking at Christ. The more we look at him, the more like him we become. So I think that if we want to become more compassionate, we need to look at more passages like this in terms of how compassionate he really is, because the Spirit of God then begins to transform us into that image. And then I think that the other point which you made is to look at people, because the more you know about people, the more you notice about people, if you fulfill the confession and you're looking at Jesus to become more like him, the Spirit of God will begin to use that in you to make you compassionate, because you'll see things about people. You'll get out of your head, and that's, and my wife too emphasized that. She said, "Yeah, you don't look at people. Yeah, you've got to notice things about people. Observe. Did you observe this? Did you observe that? Same thing. I think women are probably better at this than most guys are."
Yeah, there's an intuition there.
Yeah.
And I mean, the Hebrew word for compassion is womb for a reason.
Yeah.
There is, but again, I've used that as an excuse.
Yeah. Yeah.
Rather than saying, well, no, it's God's compassion ultimately
Yes.
that I want to be in me.
Yeah.
And I think the other thing is, compassion is often compared to having a tender heart as well, a tenderness toward people. And obviously the opposite of tenderness is callousness.
Yeah.
And so another way to get at this is to say, what gives me a callous heart? Or how do I shield my heart? Because a shielded heart will not be a compassionate heart toward people. You have to really connect with people to have compassion.
Yeah.
And so it kind of works in each direction. So I think it means obviously loving people and willing to be disappointed, committing and willing to have your heart broken in a way is one. C.S. Lewis talks about that. Better to have your heart broken than to make it unbreakable.
Yeah.
But it also means being honest with people and cultivating honest relationships. Because as you experience mercy, you become a more merciful people in relationships too.
Yeah.
And so I think that's another way to keep your heart tender. That's a big thing. I want. A strong spine and a soft heart is Jesus.
Yeah.
And you want both.
Yeah. Yeah.
Some people have such a soft heart that they'll just get bowled over. They lose their principle. They lose themselves. They fail to differentiate. And what's amazing about Jesus is he always pleases God. He won't cow to people's demands.
Yeah. Yeah.
And yet he's moved by compassion.
Yeah.
So it's an amazing thing. It's
really is.
so rare to see someone who can be both differentiated in that way and compassionate.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's good.
Yeah.
It's really good.
Yeah.
So great passage.
Great passage.
And you handled it very well.
Well, thanks, Dad.
You really did.
Well, any other thoughts?
I think I am thought out.
Yeah. Thoughtless. Yeah. Well, thanks, listeners. I hope this helped you to grow in faith, to grow in compassion. And we'll be back soon to keep talking about Luke.